It was November 1952, and a cold wind had settled over the airfield like a warning. The smell of hydraulic fluid and burnt cordite clung to the tarmac, and the sky was a washed sheet of iron. I remember the sound first, a hollow metallic groan that came before the flashes, as if something large exhaled under pressure. At 0 hour, pilots scrambled. Radios hissed static in a thin, high-pitched choir, and the ground crew stood with their hands jammed into coat pockets against the cold. What we found later in the crater should not have been possible in that year. At first glance, it looked like a wingless aircraft, a flattened dome of alloy that reflected the runway lights like a dark pool. But its seams showed machining that would not exist for decades. It had been shot down by radar trackers and trained guns, but its hull held inscriptions in a script that used characters I did not recognize, and numeric stamps with dates that belonged to a future none of us had lived through. I was 29 then, a young technical journalist with the Air Command, and I am the one who kept the logbook that would become the center of an inquiry no one in 1952 had vocabulary for. What I will tell you is about that night, about choices made in the name of national security, and about a device we later named the temporal core. If you want to follow how a misidentified UFO revealed a fracture in the timeline, listen closely and stay with me through the whole account. The crater smelled of ozone and hot metal. Rain had begun to fall in thin sheets that made the alloy shimmer, and my boots sloshed in a puddle that tasted faintly of copper. Major Harold Evans crouched at the edge and clicked his cigarette into the mud. He looked at the hull and said, "It should have been vaporized." The phrase hung in the damp air like a verdict. Sam Hargrove, the radar operator who had actually seen the contact on his scope, stood away from the object with his back turned, hands over his mouth, as if to quiet his breathing. There were marks on the skin that suggested a heat event localized to the belly, not an explosion. Dr. Lena Ortiz, a visiting physicist from a federal research institute, ran a small handheld spectrometer along the seam and reported numbers into her notebook with the flat cadence of someone reporting anomalies. "Alloy composition inconsistent with known metallurgy," she said. Miriam Cho from the Office of Historical Preservation ran a gloved hand along an engraving. "This script is not any alphabet I recognize," she said. The scene was loud with human voices and quiet with the gravity of the impossible. As the lead correspondent, I felt the tug of two instincts, one to explain, one to protect. I pocketed my pen, closed the notebook, and promised myself I would not let what we found be turned into myth. I signed the logbook, Evidence File 52C-11. That same night, a telegram deprived us of certainty when Washington ordered the field sealed, men reassigned, and the object carried away under escort. I would later learn that the orders came with instructions to alter records when necessary and to apply the phrase temporal displacement in reports that would never see publication. Entering the craft was like stepping into a moved room from another century. The hatch yielded with a pressure sigh, and the air that escaped smelled faintly of warm copper and ozone, like a shop where copper wire is stripped. Inside, a ring of faint blue light traced a floor that was not metal nor composite, but something in between, slick and granular like wet sand behind glass. The passageways were low and narrow, angled in a way that made my ribs ache after a minute, and every surface hummed with a barely audible frequency that set my molars on edge. We threaded a line of technicians in borrowed suits, lights bobbing, breath forming ghosts in the chilled interior. Symbols repeated along the corridor, etched so precisely they caught the light and fractured it into tiny pinpricks. Dr. Ortiz ran an instrument along one symbol and murmured, "This resonates at multiples of 7.2 kilohertz across the pattern. It's an intentional encoding." In the tight corridor, we argued about whether to back away, but curiosity won. The air tasted faintly of metallic dust and something floral, the latter smell impossible to place. Peter Klein, an aeronautical engineer, iced his fingers and said, "It is not a craft designed to cross the sky the way we think. It uses displacement fields to modify local chronology. That remark landed in the passageway like a thrown stone. We set up a recorder. Jonas Reed, a technician, clipped a microcamera to his collar and took steady footage as Greta Weber, a linguist we had flown in that day, traced the symbols with latex gloves and a small brush. Our first recorded words inside the hull were rambling attempts to qualify the unknown. I remember Sam saying, "It looked like a ghost on the scope then, a body in the sky." Jonas replied, "It landed like a bell." Greta said, "These are anchors, not decorations." Peter asked, "Anchors for what?" Dr. Ortiz answered, "Temporal anchoring points, places where a displacement field tethers the craft to a target epoch." I asked, "Target epoch? You mean they came from somewhere else in time?" She looked at me directly and said, "Not so much from as through. Imagine threading a needle through layers of probability." Harold added, "Then why did it crash here in 1952? Greta looked down at an inset panel and traced faded numerals with a finger. Because someone needed to get out, and they miscalculated the overlay neural sequence. Miriam asked quietly, "Or they were forced." The radio outside hissed as if someone else were trying to speak, but caught. Those initial exchanges multiplied into plans, to document, to recover samples, to seal, and to leave no rumor. We argued as professionals do, with clipped sentences and tempers fraying at the edges. We cataloged photos, spectra, and sound records into the logbook and began to find contradictions that would unmoor us. A black and white photograph taken by the base photographer showed the craft lying where we had found it, but in the glass reflection of its polished dome was an image of a runway light that in our century had not been erected until 1967. A film still from Jonas Reed's collar camera, after slow development, contained a shadow figure with clothing that matched no 1950s silhouette. The cut of the coat had a synthetic sheen and pockets in places our tailors did not use. Dr. Ortiz ran X-ray diffraction on a sample of the hull and found crystalline arrangements that matched later generation alloys and also contained isotopic ratios that suggested exposure to a field causing minute temporal decay inconsistent with natural radioactivity curves. The decay profile suggests the material has been subject to repeated short-term displacement events, she wrote in the lab ledger. At first, we thought it was a trick, a hoax with modern materials planted to provoke intrigue. But then Miriam unearthed a small logbook sealed in a compartment near what we later called the temporal core. Its pages were written in an unfamiliar hand and dated with sequences that read like military timestamps, and something else, something more like calendar knots. In one margin, a word recurred in English, scrawled like a prayer: anchoring. The presence of a logbook with dates beyond 1952 unhinged the initial explanations. Sam said, either someone from the future came back and crash-landed, or we are seeing evidence of a technology that can borrow dates like fabric. Jonas, looking at the annotated photo, whispered, "What if it was an emergency landing from a time traveler?" If you are skeptical, as I was at first, I understand. If you are asking if this is real, I asked the same questions and I wrote them down in the logbook. If you found one piece of evidence that contradicted your timeline, how would you proceed? Prime your answer with these words. Prime question. I want to read your reactions. Leave that line in the comments so I can bring the most interesting ones into the archive and discuss them with the team in our next release. Your input will shape what we investigate next, and the best comments will be read aloud in future videos. Now, let me continue with what happened after the initial documentation. My own past is not incidental to this story. I grew up in a coastal town where salvage men came ashore with odd pieces of wreckage from the sea and tales of vessels that were not theirs. I learned early to pry apart explanations to find what held them together, to take rusted metal to the light and read the layers like rings in a tree. When I was 12, my father taught me how to count corrosion layers on a copper bolt and told me the time when things break tells more than the thing itself. I studied journalism and engineering basics because I wanted to trace stories to their mechanical heart. In college, I lost a mentor to an accident that was documented as simple human error, though I never believed that explanation. It taught me two things: that institutions will prefer tidy narratives and that tenacity can reorder records. I came into the Air Command with a hunger to test official stories and to protect evidence that would otherwise be lost. The loss also taught me to distrust easy closures and to listen for silences in a room full of noise. When the craft was transported to a secure facility and the official report tried to close the case, my refusal to accept a sanitized narrative put me at odds with superiors. I kept private notes, letters, and the logbook, and those things became my tether to truth. The memories of my childhood, the smell of salt and machine oil, the taste of cigarettes at the hangar, the muffled sob of my own voice when I realized men were prepared to bury facts, all shaped the way I insisted we catalog everything, even when told to shut down and forget. That insistence would later cost me access and make trustworthy allies of unlikely people. The twist came 3 weeks after the crash when an offhand reading altered every assumption. Dr. Ortiz, working late, detected a faint pulse in the readings coming from the object. The pulse had a pattern that matched nothing technological cataloged in our databases, and yet it had a signature that repeated every 12 hours with minute variance. We started calling it the beat. Jonas set up a field detector and recorded the beat across a 3-day span. Greta ran linguistic analogies against the pattern and suggested it might encode temporal coordinates in a form analogous to how older sailors used star positions to orient themselves, but across a probability field. On the 4th night, a technician named Miguel Serrano, newly assigned and nervous, watched the panel that housed the temporal core when the beat shifted and a shadow formed against the door. We suddenly had a visitor of a sort a time traveler might make only in a science fiction prop. The shadow gestured, then retreated, then the beat synchronized with the guard's heartbeat in a way that seemed to recognize a human boundary. Harold, who had come to see the progress, and I argued until dawn about whether to attempt communication. The argument grew loud enough to draw the attention of security. We were not to probe this any further. The directive was simple. From a department that preferred the phrase national security, do not allow unsanctioned contact. We debated and then devised a mission that would reveal the purpose of the craft and test the hypothesis that it was not extraterrestrial, but a temporal vehicle damaged and misanchored in 1952. The briefing was harsh and moral. We named the plan Operation Return, a small party tasked to create a controlled displacement to examine the craft's intended epoch. Dr. Ortiz wrote the parameters. Sam volunteered as a pilot because he insisted he had experience with instruments that tracked non-standard contacts. Greta agreed to interpret whatever we found. Peter would attempt interface with the hull. Miriam would supervise cultural preservation risks. Jonas and Miguel would handle instrumentation and cameras, and I would document and keep the chain of custody. We discussed risk assessments and contingency plans in the brief. A displacement window of 30 seconds to 1 minute. Anchor points to ensure return. Uplink to a tethered receiver to measure field distortion. Failsafes to abort and release if the overlay neural showed contamination. The room smelled of coffee and cheap tobacco, and the tension tasted metallic on my tongue. In the briefing, we ran a simulation of the field, and I recorded the procedure in detail for later publication. Procedure Note 1. Initial interface involves aligning the craft's exterior glyphs with the field emitters at multiples of 7.2 kHz, then engaging the temporal harmonics with a synchronized pulse that increases energy input by 17% for 0.8 seconds. Field measurements must remain within the bracket of 2.4 to 3.1 Tesla equivalent to prevent phase slippage. All operators wear insulated gloves weighted to 6 kilovolts to prevent neural overlay. We documented this in a short protocol and encrypted the record. The explanation in plain language. We would try to push the craft a breath forward along its probability curve and then pull it back. The idea was to let it reveal where it came from without letting anything from that place stay here. The procedure description reads dry, but each line carried a moral weight. When we first attempted the controlled displacement, the ship reacted like a living thing. The floor hum rose into a chord of tones I felt in my sternum. My senses cataloged everything: sight, the blue luminescence thickening to an inner white; hearing, the low chord that turned into a keening like wind through a pipe; smell, a fleeting scent of rain on hot stone; taste, the electric aftertaste that lingered on my tongue; touch, a vibration under my feet like a distant engine. We had 10 exchanges during that attempt, and those conversations are burned into my memory as tightly as any image. Jonas called out meter readings. Dr. Ortiz translated them into probabilistic coordinates. Sam adjusted the tether. Peter physically tapped a seam. Greta recited a sequence of numbers as if reading a litany. Miguel, hands shaking, checked the camera feed and announced, "I am getting a frame from outside the field." Harold asked, "What do you see?" Miguel answered, "Landscape looks wrong. The trees are dense and tall and—" "There are structures without chimneys," Jonas said. "We are not seeing an alien city. Those are stabilized domes with reflective panels." I asked, "Do they have people?" Miguel whispered, "I can see silhouettes. They are moving in patterns as if choreographed." Dr. Ortiz ordered us to abort when an energy spike registered. The instrument panel reported contamination levels rising, and Jonas shouted, "Overlay neural feedback increasing, cut the pulse!" The field snapped like a muscle, and we all staggered as if hit. When we recovered, the camera feed had a smear and a single frame containing a person whose face looked older and then younger simultaneously. We froze the frame and printed it. The printed image looked like a poor wetted photograph with double exposure, but Greta swore the mouth formed a name when rotated 90 degrees. It was then we understood that the craft had not come empty-handed. It had carried a living passenger whose neural signature could imprint across time when exposed. The first extended moment of tension came when the backup battery failed mid-procedure and we faced the prospect of someone or something staying. The room was a tableau of motionless faces and the smell of burnt insulation. I remember the taste of copper and the ringing in my ears. Harold said, "We bring it back now or we lose it all." Dr. Ortiz argued, "We need another 10 seconds to stabilize the harmonics." Sam looked between them and said, "10 seconds will kill us if the core locks to an external anchor." Jonas and McGill fumbled a manual override. Peter told them to breathe and move in a pattern he described in short, precise orders. They did, and for a heartbeat, the lights synchronized. The battery coughed, and the field collapsed. The camera feed returned a single frame of grainy light, and then nothing. Afterward, we realized the passenger had left a trace, a residue in the panel that smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil, and held a crystalline particle that later analysis suggested had been cultured in a marine environment, no longer common in 1952. That residue became our proof that someone had attempted to land here in an emergency and had not intended to make this epoch their home. We wrestled not just with procedures, but with ethics. Operation Return had become an act of intrusion into other possible lives. We had a logbook with names and dates that included a hatch date stamped with a future year and a soldier's scrawl that read like an apology. Greta translated a fragment that included the phrase, "Anchorage failed," and a plea to avoid contamination. Miriam insisted we adopt a preservation-first stance, do no harm to the historical continuum. Harold argued national security, the imperative to know. Dr. Ortiz argued for containment. Our debates were not sterile, they invited risk. The second moment of tension occurred when a liaison from a secretive office proposed removing the core and weaponizing its ability to shift localized timelines. He spoke in clinical terms, eyes cold, and suggested that with bounded experiments we could accelerate weapon development. The room smelled suddenly like bleach and fear. I asked him, "Do you know the human cost?" He replied without flinch, History is malleable if you have the technology. Jonas stood and said, "We cannot hand that to the kind of men who rewrite record books to suit power." The liaison said, "You are naive." The fourth exchange tilted the moral scale. In the end, Greta, Miriam, and I sided against the weaponization, and the liaison withdrew under pressure from above. The moment left fissures in our group and a realization that secrecy would still attempt to suffocate ethics. Technical Procedure Note 2. Field retraction must not exceed delta probability of 0.002 units per centric cycle, or resonant slippage will cause phase entanglement. If entanglement occurs, the patient patch may present as simultaneous age variance and cause neural overlay. In plain terms, pull too hard on time and you can make someone exist in multiple ages at once. Keep the pull gentle, monitor neural signatures, and avoid over-tuning harmonics to the 7.2 kHz baseline. Our recording of this specification was used to brief limited teams later, but every dissemination increased risk. We decided to run one more controlled insertion, but with stricter constraints and a moral clause. If any sign of living contamination or temporal health risk surfaced, we would destroy the core. Sam volunteered again with a grim joke. "I will test the night sky and tell you if it behaves." The mission plan included a disguised vessel to access a coordinate outside our compound where the craft had locked a remote anchor. We moved at dawn in the kind of silence that swallowed the usual clatter of boots and radios. The insertion sequence included 12 precise exchanges between team members once we reached the hull and prepared to re-engage the field. Those exchanges were terse and operational, but they carried the weight of people who knew they might erase or be erased. Jonas. Cameras live. Miguel. Recorders on. Stabilizers set. Dr. Ortiz. Harmonics at baseline. Increase to 17%. Peter. External tether secure. Feed to neutralizer ready. Greta. Anchoring phrase clear. Read when you need me to. Miriam. Preservation team ready to document and vacate. Harold. Security in position. No interference. Sam. Engaging in 3, 2, 1. I said, hold to contingency B if overlay noise exceeds 0.05. Jonas. Ready. Miguel. Now. Dr. Ortiz. Pulse up. Hold. Monitor. I see an imprint. Coordinate stable. There is a person. Jonas. Overlay climbing. Contingency B. Peter. Shut it down. Sam. We are moving back. The insertion gave us a view of a coastline with angular structures and a sky smeared with an unfamiliar aurora. There were people walking in compact uniforms that reflected the sun in a lattice pattern. One of them looked directly at the camera and raised a hand. The gesture lasted a second that stretched into a moral abyss. Greta whispered, "They are calling, or someone taught them to call." In the confusion, a pulse of feedback hit our suits, and a word imprinted in my ears. Not heard, but felt, the way a name sits on the back of your throat. The field collapsed, and we staggered into the air with our hearts thudding like drums. For a time we were silent, each of us tasting ash from the near exposure. The third large moment of tension followed when Miguel's camera footage showed an image of a child inside the remote anchor zone who held a medallion that later matched a fragment we recovered from the craft. The child in the frame looked out and smiled, and the smile was so entire that Harold swore he could no longer argue for weaponization. It was the kind of humanizing data point that melts bureaucratic resolve. After the insertion, we returned to a facility that had become less a place of work and more a cathedral of decision. We sat with the logbook and cross-referenced the symbols, the dates, and the residues. Greta produced a translation that read in fragments, "Emergency landing, attempt to anchor to humanitarian node, extraction failed, contamination risk, apologetic will." The voice in the logbook was not alien in intent, it was human in tone. I began to suspect that the craft was part of an organized effort to extract people from future localized catastrophes, and that on this attempt something went horribly wrong. The question then moved from what to why. Why would future operators risk a crash into 1952? The answer had at its core a moral calculus and a desperate urgency. We discovered that the year listed in the logbook corresponded to a chronogram cycle associated with a predicted collapse of several coastal cities. The passenger had tried to anchor to a node of human survivability and had been shot down when their beacon briefly matched our radar signatures. The implication was stark. Someone in the future had attempted to remove populations from a predicted disaster, and our defensive action had interrupted a rescue. Conscience fractured the group's consensus. We then encountered sabotage. A virus, not biological but temporal in name, had been introduced into the craft by an unknown actor to force a particular sequence. The sabotage aimed to sweep a contingency where the core would not merely displace but supplant, imposing a micro-history. Our detection software flagged overlapping signatures and a residue of encrypted orders that favored partial data erasure. That night, Jonas, working alone, found a backdoor in the core's access protocol that suggested external interference. He called me, voice thin, and said, "Someone wanted this gone, or turned." We rushed to his bench and found schematic alterations intended to scramble timestamps and hide the presence of the passenger. The sabotage could have erased knowledge that a rescue had been attempted from the future and could have buried the moral responsibility of those who fired on them.
Craft. We were faced with a decision: restore the record and face the political consequences of having possibly shot at those trying to help their descendants, or sanitize the log so a narrative of national defense prevailed. The group splintered. Miriam argued for full transparency, Harold for containment, Greta for controlled release, Peter for encryption, and Jonas for public archive with redactions to protect individuals. I sat between them and felt the history settle like dust. We planned an exposure to the public, a measured leak of documents that would force an inquiry. The leak included images, spectrographs, and the logbook entries that implicated the radar operators. The leak was small and precise, and then the machinery of secrecy attempted to crush it. A legal counsel threatened prosecution under national security statutes. Men with polite faces arrived and said phrases that meant, "Forget the photographs." I remember their perfume smelled like money. They offered deals and threats. One of them, a man named Caldwell, said, "This should not leave the file." Jonas replied, "Then tell us what you know." Caldwell's jaw tightened. He slid a photograph across the table. It was a printed frame of a human face that matched the imprint we had seen in the camera feed. His hand refused to tremble. He said, "This was a sanctioned extraction. You were told to stand down." Greta whispered, "Sanctioned by whom?" He leaned forward and said, "By a committee that includes people you probably pay taxes to, people who forecast probability curves and choose interventions." The implication was that our utility had run against their calculus, and they preferred a tidy timeline. That moment was a crucible. We made a choice to preserve evidence rather than surrender it. Jonas and I encrypted duplicates of the logbook and distributed them to people we trusted: a university archive, a clergyman of integrity in a seaside parish, a journalist who owed me a favor, and an institutional trustee. We also placed a sealed deposit at a national library with instructions to open in 50 years or upon a verified event. The moment of deciding was protracted and soaked in adrenaline. We agreed to secure the core physically and to dismantle parts that could be weaponized. The dismantling involved Procedure Note 3. Removal of the temporal core must be executed by cutting power in a sequenced approach, using a neutralizer coil with current ramped at 2 amps per second until 240 volts is reached, then a soft disengagement to prevent resonant bounce. We performed that operation in daylight, with hands that remembered the smell of burnt copper, and with the moral knowledge that we were either preserving lives yet to be born or covering up a rescue. The final confrontation occurred when an official team arrived and attempted to seize the core intact for relocation. We opposed them, and the standoff lasted into the night. There were 3 extended paroxysms of noise and human pleading, each with decisions that could have altered countless lives.
The first confrontation ended with an official promise to convene a review panel. The second ended with the panel requesting to hold the core for analysis under classified conditions. The third ended with Jonas and I having to choose whether to trigger a controlled detonation to render the core irretrievable. I recall the taste of metal in my mouth and the smell of diesel from the generator that powered the containment field. I think of Miguel's face when he realized the core could be destroyed. He said, "If we lose it, we lose proof." I replied, "If we keep it, we lose our souls." In that thrumming corridor of decision, we made the choice to partially dismantle the core, in a way that preserved tracers for later analysis, but removed the capacity for macro displacement. We hid the remaining schematic in the sealed archives, and I kept a copy of the log for my own conscience. After the dust settled, the official story transformed. The Air Command issued a terse release about an experimental aircraft of unknown origin, neutralized and confiscated. Press accounts called it a UFO sighting and then moved on. Our group scattered with different degrees of compromise. Harold returned to duty and later denied having seen much. Sam left the service, his face older with burden. Dr. Ortiz returned to the lab and wrote papers under pseudonyms. Greta moved into linguistics and quietly worked with groups on pattern analysis. Miriam returned to archaeology with a restless eye for anachronism. Jonas and Miguel found work in less scrutinized industries, always looking over shoulders. I married and had children and kept the logbook in a safe deposit wrapped in linen. Years later, a file surfaced by mistake in an archive and then disappeared again, only adding to lore. The decision to partially dismantle rather than destroy remained a moral compromise I revisit in sleepless nights. The epilogue unfolds in measured time. 1 month after the incident, I received a letter in a handwriting I did not recognize, containing a fragment of a map and the phrase, "Anchor preserved." It smelled faintly of sea salt and machine oil. There was no return address. The map pointed to a coastal inlet that, in our maps, had been redesigned in the 1970s. I kept the letter folded in my wallet and checked the inlet only once, driving past and seeing nothing obvious, but sensing a shifted shore like a bruise. The months that followed were filled with small consequences. A reduction in scheduled missile tests near that coast, quiet transfers of personnel, a memoir that never published. In 3 months, an academic paper appeared under a pseudonym that referenced an anomalous metallic sample with age markers inconsistent with its stratigraphic layer. It referenced our spectrographs in a footnote, and then in the footnote was redacted. That footnote became a scandal in years to come when a historian pieced together citations and found a pattern. The public learned fragments. Media resurrected the UFO narrative. And a popular documentary mischaracterized our moral struggle as paranoia. In 6 months, the sealed deposit I had made earlier was opened by a clerk who was not supposed to have the authority. The clerk found the logbook and recognized my handwriting, and then a cascade of bureaucratic reassignments followed. The result was less tidy than the censors intended: leaks, denials, and a slow cultural reckoning about the ethics of altering timelines. People began to debate whether the act of rescuing far future lives justified harm done in mid-century. Think about that divide as you consider your own decisions about responsibility to future strangers. Some technical consequences emerged as well. The partial dismantlement left tracer materials that decades later forms the basis for safe study into low-amplitude temporal fields. The tracer modules were standardized into a framework that forbade resonance above a safe threshold. Those studies later fed ethical protocols in experimental chronology. They also formed the language of my later warnings. I wrote memos and taught a small seminar class in historical reconstruction and preservation, where we used terms like temporal contamination and anchoring as if they belonged to the lexicon of conservators. My students would ask whether knowledge of possible future suffering justifies intervention. I told them I could not answer in absolutes, only advise caution. That was my role then, and it remains my role now. The moral consequences linger. We had a choice to make about the craft and the people it may have been trying to save. We chose containment over exposure, partial preservation over wholesale destruction. We tried to prevent weaponization and maintain a record.
I can tell you with absolute honesty that the decisions haunted me more than any literal ghost. I still carry the image of the child in the foreign frame, the smile that became the hinge upon which I judged myself. If there is a single lesson from this record, it is that temporal displacement is not a convenience that solves moral problems. It compounds them. The presence of a temporal core does not absolve us of accountability. It expands the circle of responsibility. With power to shift probability comes the duty to consider those displaced and those left behind. If this narrative stirred something in you, and you want to see more documented accounts like this one, subscribe and engage with our work. We publish long-form investigations that bridge archival research and on-site recordings. By subscribing, you support careful preservation of material and help fund legal defenses that keep records accessible. Join our community and help shape what we examine next. We read and respond to thoughtful comments and periodically release raw files for public review. In closing, I return to the quiet night of the crash. The sound of the initial metallic groan, the taste of copper, the blue light that smelled of ozone remain with me. We faced the choice to alter history because someone in another time believed that future lives could justify immediate risk. We intervened to prevent weaponization and to preserve fragments of proof, but we also, inevitably, altered outcomes. My record here is partial and biased by the tactile details I remember. Humidity on the runway, the sting of burnt insulation, the metallic aftertaste, the way Jonas's hands shook when he held the camera, the hush when Dr. Ortiz read the decay profile. I cannot claim we did right by everyone. I can say only that we did what we could under the constraints of fear and authority. The larger question remains open. If you could reach back with technology to save lives centuries hence, would you do it? Would you accept the moral debt? History will not let us answer with certainty, but it will force us to bear the consequences of our choices. If this story stays with you, tell me in the comments what you would have done and why. And remember, choosing to know is itself an action that shapes the future we all will inherit.